Welcome to the beginning of our third series of Working the Word. Today we're beginning a series on the Gospel of John that's going to take us quite some time to complete.
There's a fair bit in John to really dig into.
And the more you read him, the more you realise that there is to dig into. In the series one, we talked about how to read and understand the Bible for yourself. And in this series, we're going to be applying what we learned in series one. So you may need to go back and do some review.
You may find a few new tools along the way as well.
And hopefully we'll find some new tools as we go with this one. But just reminding you of some of the tools that we explored in that series. The importance of looking at context and not just taking a verse just as it is.
Particularly with John, because you've got all these threads that weave through the whole way that, if you're just taking little sections, you're going to be missing out on a lot of what he's trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that we get a lot of with John, it sort of plays into a little bit time and place as well, but John specifically gives you nods as to, where and when you are, like on the next day, or then we crossed across to this town or whatever, that he's specifically giving us some contextual clues.
And he actually gives us some timing too. Passover, another feast.
And even some of the specific linking to feasts is really, really intentional, that, it being linked to that feast is not just sort of it was in September kind of. It's linking to the feast because there is a specific context in that feast that plays into what he's the point he's making.
And certainly the intent of the book. At the beginning and at the end,
he's very explicit.
He's very clear about his intent, as he is about the picture of God that he is trying to paint in Jesus.
And it's kind of a slightly different slant to what we get from the other Gospels a lot of the time.
It's very different to the other Gospels.
And sometimes, like a little bit the parallel passages, looking at what is the same, what is shared, but there's a lot that isn't shared, and why has John included this and the other ones haven't, or why have the other ones included this but John hasn't felt it necessary? There's some of this comparison that...
And that possibly leads us to a conversation we need to have about the difference between the Gospels. Because Matthew, Mark and Luke are very similar to each other. It's almost like they're parallel accounts. That even wording, it's almost like somebody's been copying somebody.
They all kind of went to the same class and listened to that there's similarities and there's patterns that, even if they're slightly rearranged for the particular purpose of that author, there's still a lot of similarities between the first three Gospels.
And they seem to have been written fairly close to the actual time of Christ, but with a different target audience. Mark has been travelling with Peter. He's been over in Rome. His target audience seems to be the Roman population. Whereas Luke, in his introduction, says, look, Theophilus, I'm writing this to you. It's an orderly account. I've interviewed all the eyewitnesses.
Which is very much a Greek mindset.
And Matthew is very much a Hebrew sort of
talking
mindset.
to the Jewish context.
So you can have the same story tailored for the audience to which it's written. And each of them has a unique component.
And some of the tailoring might simply be, for example, there are notes that Mark and Luke are going to have to give on Jewish custom that Matthew can just go, well, they know this background. We don't need to go into it. Whereas Luke might have to kind of add a little side note as to what this actually means.
But actually about 90% of Mark finishes up in Matthew. And quite a significant portion in Luke.
And we've got, Mark talks a lot about action, what Jesus does, but he doesn't really get into what Jesus talks about as much.
Whereas Luke is very much about Jesus' teachings. And Matthew, how it fulfilled the prophets.
And Matthew in particular brings a bit of a kingdom focus as well. Sort of, that's one of the key themes that's weaving through Matthew. And each of them, even telling the same story in similar ways, that they each have their sort of slightly different themes that they're exploring.
They're working for a different audience. But basically they're telling the same story. Matthew and Luke both talk about the birth of Jesus.
Whereas John doesn't touch it at all.
and neither does Mark.
Mark sort of jumps in halfway through.
The baptism.
Yeah.
Jesus is 30 by the time...
Mark gets into the picture, yeah.
But they spend a lot of time talking about what Jesus did, what he taught, and then, like all the Gospels, his death and resurrection. And
a lot of it seems to follow kind of a narrative flow. Like we sort of start at the beginning, we work through his teachings and everything, and when we get to the end, and, it's an orderly account. And John kind of sets out to do something different to just an orderly account.
And John's style is very different because he doesn't begin with Jesus' birth.
No.
He begins with the phrase,
in the beginning.
Whenever the beginning was.
And he sort of encompasses a much deeper and richer theology within, that he's had more time to think on this stuff. And
maybe things have changed. It might be helpful just to give ourselves a little bit of a time frame. That here, late 20s through to the early 30s, here is Jesus' life, teachings, his ministry. He dies early into maybe 31. And then you have the book of Acts. They spread out. Somewhere in the mid-60s, around 64, 65, we believe, Peter and Paul both come to their final time, are executed and buried. And 5 or 6 years later, in 70 AD, the Romans come to Jerusalem. It's totally destroyed. Mark, from what we can work out, somewhere mid-50s, writes his gospel.
And we're pretty sure that Mark was around at the time that Matthew and Luke wrote theirs.
And we're almost certain that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark.
Yes.
Because they've taken it lock, stock and barrel, but they've incorporated additional material that they share.
And adapted it for their audiences.
And they both got unique material that's not in the other Gospels. And so they come shortly thereafter. But John's Gospel, from what we can work out, comes almost towards the end of the 1st century.
I mean, if you dig into the scholarship, there is some conjecture over almost all of these points, but as best we can tell, this seems to be the one that makes the most sense, just based on like the way he refers to things, like the sort of knowledge he seems to have about events that have already happened and the way he speaks of them. And just, what the themes that he's addressing kind of line up with this kind of dating as opposed to this kind of dating, which is some of the other suggestions.
Basically, there are some who have it just before 70 AD, and they base that on one verse, which is always...
And the other thing is some of the grammar that he refers to in the present tense as opposed to the past tense, or the past tense as opposed to the present tense, which again is not...
One verse.
It's not a huge thing to base an entire decision when there's plenty of other evidence.
And so we look at it and we ask ourselves the question, what changed?
Because you've got about 30 years further.
And how much can change in a church in 30 years? What changed? And it has led to this radically different style of the gospel.
And I think we've also got, yes, we've got further distance here. There's things that have changed in the church, but I think we've got to account for there being changes in John as well. I mean, we get a really, really clear picture of the changes in Peter. He's kind of the front and center of the group. You see it. But with, John, we believe is, James and John, sons of Zebedee. which were also kind of known as sons of thunder. Now you've got this John who's come from this young son of thunder, probably fairly fiery, to writing this compassionate, loving, deep theology gospel that he has had a little bit more time to think and reflect and kind of start seeing patterns. And one of the things he often does in his gospel is draw our attention to some of these patterns. Whereas, these ones, they've written kind of a narrative, but John's taken a little bit more time to think and reflect and put some dots together and be able to kind of give you a more nuanced and richer picture, I think.
But the world has changed. As the apostles predicted, Paul, who was talking to the elders of the church in Ephesus.
Which is round about the area that we were pretty sure that John was working in.
John, in his later years, was the pastor of the church at Ephesus before he got exported to Patmos. So Paul is writing to the same church, I know that after my departure, grievous wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from your own selves, men will rise up speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them.
And one of the things we looked at when we were looking at some of the epistles is that we, from what they're addressing, we can tell a little bit of what's actually been going on. That, you don't just write random, instruction in this kind of way that, what we're being told gives us some clues as to what's being addressed. And I think that Paul is giving us some big clues here as to what John is ultimately.
And John gives us a clue also in his first letter.
Yes.
Beloved, don't believe every spirit, but test the spirits, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. There might be a clue right there. Many false prophets. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ having come in the flesh is of God. Again, another little clue. What issues might be around that he is having to confront and protect the church from? Every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not of God. This is the Antichrist, which you heard that is coming and now is already in the world. So the world has changed.
And, you can get a really strong sense here that, of that protective sense that he's going, there's all these things going on. You need to be, aware, testing the spirits, paying attention. Don't just, cruise on by because, it sounded good and somebody from church said it or whatever, that, you really need to be paying attention here because there are things that are going to creep up that might sound initially good if you don't have the basis.
And the other writers had simply told the story of Jesus. John now is protecting the church. We actually have the writings of some of the early church leaders. It's actually a 12-volume set.
A lot of reading.
And this is the apostolic leaders, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. Justin Martyr is a disciple of John.
Because there's distinct overlap here.
There's an overlap. And when he's writing about some of the issues that they are confronting, when Irenaeus writes a book against heresies, you get a clue that perhaps some things are happening.
Some heresies have crept in.
And as we read the writings of the church leaders at the time, we discover that there were some big issues. Things like Gnosticism, who had the idea that the God of heaven, the true God, did not create our world. It was created by our inferior, almost a bad God. And material things were bad. Spiritual was good. And there was special knowledge. If you wanted to get out of here, there was special knowledge. And if you didn't have that knowledge, you weren't going to make it.
And I mean, even now, there are some of these echoes that can sort of incidentally be passed down through, like, just the idea of the earth being evil. It's kind of an idea that has some echoes in just broad Christian thinking without, getting into the specifics, but, earth evil, heaven good.
And they rejected the idea of a resurrection because that's body, body, flesh, that's evil. And so they came to the idea that only the soul goes to heaven when you die, which the early church leaders rejected.
But again, it's kind of an idea that has lingered.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't just kind of go Gnosticism, well, that's clearly not a great idea, dump it. There's still echoes of it around.
And it was a big thing at the time.
Mm.
It had a very close cousin called Docetism, who took this idea that matter is evil and took it to the next step, that Christ only appeared to be human. Because if the material world is evil and corrupt, how could Christ possibly have a real human body?
It's almost like an early sci-fi version of like a hologram or something, that he existed, but like you couldn't actually, but again, one of the things you can see coming through in John's gospel is the physicality and humanity of Jesus, not just his, that he was divine and he was human.
And John suddenly makes a whole lot more sense when you realise the world in which he was living and writing.
He's not just kind of adding some of these random details just for funsies. He's putting them specifically in there because he's addressing something.
That Jesus' death was a real thing. His resurrection was a real thing.
And I mean, you start running into some really big problems if the death and the resurrection weren't actually real things.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot of theological sticking points here that, it has lots of flow-on effects, that this doesn't work and this doesn't work if it isn't, as he said, that he wasn't human.
In fact, we even know who some of the people were.
Mm.
For example, you may remember Simon Magus in the book of Acts, who responded to Peter's preaching, and then when he saw the Holy Spirit was given by laying on of hands, and said, how much is it going to cost for me to buy this ability?
Mm. Someone missed the point.
And he then went on working magic, finished up in Rome, being actually called a god, and pushing this whole Gnosticism thing.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, his disciple Meander, and the church leaders talk about these people and how John had to combat them. And then there was Cerinthus. Again, he's pushing this. He came from Egypt. Mm-hmm. He's pushing this idea that the world wasn't made by the primary God. It's an inferior God and angels. And the Nicolaitans, who John had to refer to in Revelation, are followers of Cerinthus. So there's a whole lot being going on when John comes and starts to write.
And it makes some sense that, you can only last with something in, its pure form for a while before it starts sort of having offshoots and differences. And I think John really sitting down to put this together and compile it in a really specific way is him kind of trying to give a reference point, that all this is going to happen and come. There's going to be these teachers that are trying to sway you off, and giving you sort of a bit of a reference point and an anchor so that you can have something to test.
And so we have the Gospel of John, where John selects stories and teachings that lead to a discussion of who Jesus is. And if there's one thing that is going to come out of our study of the Gospel of John, it's this ongoing reference back to who Jesus is. And that's what we hope that you're going to discover as you journey with us in this series on the Gospel of John.
And it's something that even within the text, there's a lot of the characters are grappling with this question. That you've got, Jesus, he grew up in Nazareth, so I know his parents. Like, who is this man? Like, if you're seeing him as the dude who grew up in their neighborhood and I know his parents, it's you're not going to be seeing the bigger picture. And John is trying to give us a much bigger picture, but you've got essentially, who is this man and where did he come from? A kind of core questions that weave their way through the entire, narrative and gospel.
And they're going to divide Jesus' audience.
Consistently.
and 3 times, the word division is used as we explore it.
And I mean, there's some heavy stuff in here. And, the other accounts don't go quite as deep into it, but there's some heavy going in John.
Because the other accounts were what Jesus did, what Jesus said. This one is, what does it all mean? How does it fit into that big picture of...
And John seemed to be really preoccupied, not just with telling you what Jesus said and did, but what he meant, what his motives were. That it's not just, here's an account, it's I want you to understand the bigger picture. I want you to be able to connect all these dots and see what he was here trying to do, not just kind of read his story and be done.
And understanding who he is, realise that these other teachings that are coming in, that are floating around, are not the Jesus who was here, but one that's been picked up in men's minds.
And I think one of the other key things that comes from this sort of drive on this question is that the other ones, the other Gospels kind of give you an account, but you can just sort of follow along and pay attention, whereas John kind of throws you into the deep end a few times.
He is very intentional in what he's doing, and he's not hiding what he's trying to achieve.
And he doesn't really allow space for fence sitting. Either he's telling the truth, and there's some hard things to swallow, or he's a liar and it's all gone. He doesn't really leave room for fence sitting. That, he's calling his readers to make a choice, make a decision. That he's very explicit in his purpose. He says.
No, right in the first chapter, the true light who enlightens every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. The world didn't know him. He came to his own, and his own didn't receive him. But as many as received him, he gave them authority to be children of God. And there's that parting of the ways that's looked at before he's even told any of the stories. In this story, Jesus, who created the world, is going to come to his own. And his own aren't going to know him, but some are.
It's almost like he's setting up an essay here, like he's giving his introduction, his opening points. He's setting up the themes that he's going to be revisiting, because these are themes that he does revisit.
Yes.
That, he's kind of setting up these motifs, and he keeps coming back to them and adding a little bit each time, and coming back and adding a little bit each time, so that by the time you get to the end, it's sort of grown into this much fuller concept where you understand a lot more of what he was talking about in this initial discourse.
Many of these words like light, receive, believing. Believing is a key word in this gospel.
I mean, he explicitly says it at the end where he's talking about, so indeed Jesus did many things, many other signs in the presence of disciples not written in the book, but these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. He's explicit. This is why I wrote it. This is what I want to do. And it actually sort of separates out. You can see it even in the form, he sets out his introduction. But then we have sort of a cluster of essentially signs, which, written that you may believe. And then we get into a cluster which is more kind of like a glory or an exaltation, and that believing you have life in his name. They're working in tandem here, and he's very explicit in this is what I'm doing. There's no hidden agendas here. I'm putting it all out on the table.
Chapter 1, this is where we're going to go. Chapter almost the end. This is where we've been, and this is why I've told you all of this.
And it's like it's beautiful essay form, really. Like it's a nice, tidy conclusion that really just sums up everything he's been working on. That all of the signs we've talked about, all of the teaching, all of the glorification and the exaltation, which is a slightly different perspective on the crucifixion and the resurrection that we will get to. But all of this is so that you may believe, and so that by believing you may have life in his name. Like that's all he wants. That's it.
That's what he said he was going to give us in chapter 1. And that's where he points us.
And you can kind of see those themes growing to this point. And it's sort of a really, really lovely little bookend, being able to kind of see where we're going, see where we went, and see how that develops and grows in the middle.
So he tells us the purpose of his gospel. So perhaps we ought to talk for a minute or two about the process that you and I are going through as we're sort of preparing for this. How do you begin to get into this? So let's talk about the process that we've gone through. What we've actually done is we've printed it out and then bound it. We've given ourselves nice wide margins so that we've got room to make notes.
Or little pictures in my case.
Pictures. And then we've read it through with John's stated purpose in mind. His purpose is so that we will believe. So I don't know about you. I went through and I underlined every occasion of the word believe.
Yes, I've done believe. I mean, there's a few really key words that he sets up in the beginning that, like, initially are just sort of a key. Follow this, follow this, follow this.
Words like life.
Life, word, light.
Darkness, witness. And then you've got Father and Son. So I read it again, following each of these words through. So I've read this gospel multiple times in a day.
And like we're just starting.
And then we read it again, noting contrasting themes that were there. And again, looking for patterns. Is there a pattern here?
Which is one of the tools we talked about in season 1. And like your process might look a bit different to this. Like my process is slightly different.
Yes.
But I think part of it is also kind of figuring it out as you go, like taking some of these tools and seeing what works.
And one of the things that I do is I pick up the logic words. And, but, yet. Which
is challenging in John, because John doesn't come up for air very often. Like, we tend to think of the logic words as, this, if this, then this, kind of, conditional almost. Whereas with John, it's very much progressive, but it's and this happened, and therefore, that it's just this one continuous woven line that starts at the beginning and finishes at the end, and he doesn't really come up for breath a lot.
And his use of therefore turned out to be not traditional.
No, very much not.
His use of therefore is as a consequence of that.
Sort of following on from this, we're moving into the next one, that it's all connected, but it doesn't have the traditional use of therefore. And if it did, it's just come up for air, John, come up for air.
He didn't write with full stops. This is the problem.
And it's just sort of, continuous. It's long, it's chunky, but at the same time, if we look at the ands and the therefores and such, but we kind of see it, it's a progression of moving. It's not the way we'd normally use it. And once you can start sort of just seeing how he's using it to weave the movement, it makes a lot more sense, and you stop being less bugged by and.
So there is a whole lot of that, and now that we've drawn your attention to it, it's like the dust on the mantelpiece. Somebody apologises, look, I'm sorry, I haven't done the dusting.
And you hadn't noticed the dust until that point.
Yeah, until that point I hadn't noticed, but thank you for drawing my attention to it.
And I think one of the other things is like going through, like I've actually got sticky notes at the beginning of mine that as I'm going through, if I get another, like, oh, that looks interesting, I'd like to explore that, I'll make a sticky note and put it at the beginning so that I don't get distracted this time. But I can, kind of come back and go, okay, let's chase this one through now. And invariably, when I sort of clear a sticky note, I've added 3 more. But there's as you go through, these things will pop out. You will see new things. And seeing, this connection to this connection, that'll be another thing to trace.
So it's not something that we can say, well, yes, I've read it. The first time you read it, you don't see a whole lot at all. But the more that you read it, and maybe if there's something we could encourage people in, is to take this book and to read it on a regular basis.
And not just sort of read for the sake of repetition, which is one of the things that sometimes it can be really easy to fall into if you're just studying the Bible, following your reading plan. That you're sort of like, well, I tick that off for the day. That it's not just kind of reading it through, reading it through just to read it through absolutely has benefit. But the more you sort of spend time and dig in and go, oh, that's interesting, ask questions, think about it. Like, wait, I noticed this in that previous chapter. I wonder if these are related. Spoiler alert, John, probably. That just the more you go through it, the more you see. And it's more about spending time with it and engaging with it than just like reading it multiple. You could read it, once a day for a month. And you're not necessarily going to get the same things as if you spent, 2 or 3 days a week doing a more in-depth read or going really in-depth on a different section each time or something.
I think you're getting the idea that we're both approaching this independently. That Annali's got her copy, I've got my copy. But then we get together and we say, what have you found? What have you found? And we're both finding things that, I didn't notice that. And we see it the next time that we go through.
And even just sort of, differences in approach, like I'm making little like pictures and visual image, like you're using colour and I'm still using colour, but I'm using colour for words, but I'm also kind of, I've got little landmark signals whenever John's giving us and the next day, or then we crossed across to, where John is specifically giving us a glimpse into, time, place, context, kind of giving you a grounding. I've put little landmark notes. Or like I've made a word cloud I just dumped the book of John into a word cloud maker and saw what came out. Just sort of explore, I've been kind of approaching this in a creative way, seeing what things I can, whereas your brain works in a slightly different way. And I think because they kind of complement each other, that you're probably a little bit more analytical in the way your brain works. And so it's interesting to see where there's overlap and where there's just sort of, okay, that's different.
So there is so much to be gained from just comparing notes. And there's a lot of pleasure in it. And perhaps we ought to talk just about some of the tools that we're using. The obvious first tool that you need is a Bible. And you can use your own. Doesn't matter to us.
And like there are advantages in using your own in that, it's something familiar and just in the way you read it. There is something that is just sort of really attractive about something that is familiar. It's a lot easier to love words that are familiar.
But there's also a danger with the familiar that you say, oh, you've read that, and you're
not processing it as much.
Your eyes skip. So what we are using is actually the Berean literal Bible. And some of the quotes you saw up there, he came to the own.
And the own.
And the own didn't. This is much more a literal, and it stops you, it slows you down to pick things up.
And I mean, even in some cases, just kind of reading through a passage in a couple of different versions. And, you know, one of the tools we looked at was comparing versions. And just sort of seeing how they translate it differently. And, you know, in terms of words, there are some words that are just not going to translate really well.
And there are some tenses that don't come over into English really well. And a more literal Bible will pick that up where...
We'll pick a little bit more of that up.
The others have tried to smooth it into nice English rather than keeping the sense.
But you've also got some that have made an attempt to kind of keep the what it would have kind of felt like to the original hearer, even if it's not quite so much of a literal connection. So, like, there's advantages in each of them just as long as you understand what you're reading.
So this is what we're using anyway. With the wide margins, we've got room to do it. If you'd like to follow along with us like this, we have put the entire text onto both the website and the Facebook page. Another reason for using the literal Berean Bible is that we have permission to do it.
Yes.
That they give us a free license to share it with you. So if you'd like to download it, turns out to about 30 pages double-sided, which fits neatly into the heat binding thing that we've got. You can stick it into a folder. And look, if that's too much of a problem, we'd be happy if you wanted to request a copy from us.
Or even if, you know, not everybody has access to things like heat binding.
But having something that you can use as a working document, a lot of people don't like to overly mark their own Bible. To have a working copy.
When it's just printed on paper, it's a lot easier to just kind of be making scribbles and notes and stuff.
So the number one tool is to have a Bible. And you're going to get most benefit if you're reading along with us. And we're not going to set reading portions. We're not going to say, this week we're looking at this. Our encouragement is for you to be reading through and through and through.
I mean, you know, each week we will be dealing with specific sections. And, you know, it's where to split it up is really not well defined. But part of the power of this is seeing everything together. And you will see that if you're reading it all the way through, as opposed to I'm reading chapter 1 this week. Because, you know, sometimes when you see that this follows directly after this and you read these two together, you get a lot richer meaning than you would if you just kind of like, okay, well, we finish here and we start here.
Another tool related to this is audio Bibles, where you can actually listen to it. And we'll put a link to one of those on the website also, so that people can link into it and go and just listen and listen. Listen when you're driving, listen when you're having a shower, whatever.
There is also a filmed version.
Visual Bible.
I would recommend reading a little bit yourself first, because sometimes if we read, you know, if we watch something, then it much more strongly influences how we're reading something. But it is worth a watch, and I'm pretty sure there is another one being made as well. But, you know, if visual is your thing, there are visual options also.
So our key really is, if we're going to be studying the book of John together, that we need to immerse ourselves in John, because that's what it's all about. Another tool that you will find useful is a pen, paper, coloured pencils.
Text in my case.
Texters, whatever. And as I use them, I will follow something like light and dark, and I will use the same colour all the way through, and you begin to see the pattern emerging. When Jesus is talking about him and his Father, and he often does, again, you begin to see that coming out. And
being able to sort of see a colour overview, but also being able to kind of see, okay, we've got this here and here and here, and being able to see them as linked, not just kind of
Random word.
Hey, that word popped up again. It's, if you're seeing a word popping up a lot, go back and see where it is and why, and ask questions.
And you can devise your own colouring system. You'll notice a very useful tool that I've got there is actually using a blade to scrape off a little bit of the pencil and then writing on what you are using this particular colour for. In this case, I'm using pink for all the times that the word believe, believing, believed pop up. So that is a very helpful thing if you're using a colour coding system just to follow the themes through the book.
That being said, you kind of do need to commit to the colour at the beginning and sort of have some ideas. Like what I've got word in dark purple and believe in light purple, because to me, having that connection and being able to see that the colours are linked. Mm-hmm. It's not just, this colour for this and this colour for this. It's like this colour and this colour kind of work together.
Okay. My mind doesn't work that way. But maybe you're putting an idea in my mind next time. There are other tools that are available, and we've, again, talked about them in Series 1, particularly Bible study software. And I don't know about you, I'm using eSword and Bible Hub. They're probably
the two most accessible, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And even just one of the things you can do with eSword is use a Bible that has the Strong's
Mm-hmm.
words listing, which isn't, you're not necessarily digging into the concordance, but there's a few cases in here where the word, logos, for example, is used, but it's not translated as word, it's translated as something else, but you don't pick that up if you're just looking at the English. Whereas if you're looking at so this word, where is this word used?
So this is getting into the original for English speakers.
Yeah, kind of a basic version that you don't necessarily have to speak Greek
mm-hmm.
To be able to follow along, but you can kind of go, okay, this number is 2606. Where is 2606 used? And you can kind of trace it through even not necessarily being able to read the Greek.
And witness and testimony coming from the same
root.
Same root was, it sort of bounced me a little bit. I had to read it again.
And it's one of the things that there's lots of nuances that you can get in the Greek that don't necessarily translate well. So, taking a little bit of extra time to go, okay, where is this word used and how can actually give us some deeper insights as well.
And again, the ability to put multiple translations on the screen at the same time.
Another, we've got eSword for the actually on your Bible software. Bible Hub is really good for digging in to, slightly deeper meanings, to looking at the interlinear. It might also be worth mentioning Bible Gateway,
yes.
that it has a lot of the versions. Like eSword is a little bit restricted in that, you can buy some versions, but the free versions, there's sort of a fairly limited number that they can offer because this is free software. Whereas Bible Gateway, you're able to actually go through and look at some of the different translations side by side, even if you don't own the Bible, that you can just kind of, be able to access some of them.
Very useful tools. Which leads us to the question, what about commentaries?
Yes, but...
We have reservations about commentaries. And our first reservation is that sometimes it makes us lazy, that we're letting someone else tell us what it means rather than taking the time to actually sit with the text. We're trying to take a shortcut.
It's almost like, we're approaching this feast and we're looking for pre-digested food as opposed to digging into the riches on the table in front of us.
And there is a difference between getting it firsthand and getting it secondhand. You're susceptible to the bias of the translator. And perhaps we ought to make a statement here. It makes you less susceptible to our bias. Did I say that?
Yes.
If you are reading it for yourself, it will protect you against whatever biases that we consciously or unconsciously
bring to the text.
that when we talk about something, you can say, well, I've read that, and that rings true, or I'll follow that further, or
I'm not so sure about that one.
So just because Annali and I say something doesn't make it so. And that's not a cop-out. We are doing our best to engage with the text and to be honest with it. But we're not the authority.
And the other thing is, like, yes, even just, we do our best due diligence that we can, but something that you discover for yourself will have way more impact than something we tell you.
And if God wants to say something to you, it may not be the same thing that he needs to tell me.
And it might not come through us. Whereas if you're spending time and engaging, you're giving God the space to kind of just nudge you towards some things that he wants you to see.
So I hope you get the feeling that we are trying to nudge you towards taking this book and making it a focus, getting a feast out of it on a regular basis over the number of months that it takes us to
get through it.
To get through it. One of the things that I'm always looking for is patterns. And after about my 10th or 12th read through, I began to notice this one, that we have a series of narratives, of stories. And then Jesus uses the story to have a discourse.
Kind of a teachable moment.
A teaching moment. And then we have an audience reaction to it. Some believed, some didn't believe.
And you've kind of, again, we're setting up this, who is this man? So we're setting up a scenario, and then we're getting to see a little bit more of a glimpse who he is. And then we're getting to that, so you may believe. Will you? And John is kind of the New Testament version of the Joshua, choose you this day who you will serve. He's like, putting the fence here that you can't sit on the fence. You're going to go one way or the other.
And they do.
And quite decisively in a lot of these stories.
A man born blind is healed. And suddenly we've got a whole discourse on light and dark and seeing and not seeing.
Which makes some people a little uncomfortable.
And the blind man says, I believe. And others here are saying, are we also blind?
And Jesus doesn't quite answer the question, but we'll get to that.
So we'll come to it. But yeah, there was this ongoing pattern, narrative, discourse, response, and they overlap. They're not separate. To various extents, they...
And particularly as John shifts perspectives, that you see it from this perspective, and then you kind of see it from this perspective, and then from this perspective, that there's overlaps, but like some of the contrast in reaction is what we're supposed to be seeing.
And there are going to be themes just running through. The theme of light and darkness just very often comes up together and then goes down. And
he keeps these paired concepts that, you'll often, if light is there, you'll often see darkness in there somewhere. That he's sort of keeping them together for a specific point.
And the same with belief and unbelief. They go together, and we get some interesting groups. We get some foreigners who believe, and we get some
locals
hometown people who don't believe.
And even just in the, we've got some of the people who don't have a big background in this, who, aren't particularly high-ranking, who can catch on to these deep theological concepts and believe. And then you've got the high theology, the sort of, I don't know, almost super conservative end of the religion at that point, who isn't, you've got these contrasts both in location and background, but also in their engagement with faith already.
And this is one of the major themes. I think it's 98 times that John uses the word believe, believing, believed.
And I mean, to be fair, he does explicitly say, I'm writing this so that you may believe.
The whole Bible only has just under 300 references to believe.
A lot of them are in John.
A third of them are in this gospel. It just is one of those key words. Look for it as you're going through. and I think you'll find plenty to make a note of. Eternal life is another theme. I've come that you might have life, have it abundantly.
And John, again, we'll get into this a little bit more later, but John has this different approach to how he talks about eternal life and even just time to how we more traditionally understand it. And I think the way he talks about eternal life being almost a present thing, that it's a present, a now but not yet, kind of brings a new layers that we don't get in the other Gospels as much.
So there are different layers that come through. The whole idea of witness and testimony, both of these words, by the way, come from the same
root.
Greek root, and often found in close proximity with judgment, judge. There's a whole package there. John is saying, look, here is the evidence. And that's what witness and testimony is about, isn't it? Here is the evidence so that you may believe.
And the judgment isn't necessarily always, like we tend to think of judgment as, God judging us. But some of the way it's approached is a little bit more of here is the evidence, judge for yourself. And, some of the way he talks about eternal life, it's not so much, when you get to the judgment, you'll find out if you made it or not. It's, you already know. And he sort of plays with it in that regard, in that, this witness and testimony, if you accept it, by believing you may have eternal life. It's not if you get to the end and you're judged worthy, which is something that it's really easy to fall into because we want to be able to.
Well, that's the Western style of judgment.
That's the way we think about it. But, John is calling us to a different approach here.
So, again, you may want to watch these words as you go through and just note them. He has many dialogues where it talks about the Father and the Son. Right from the very first verse, the Word was with God, the Word was. And we have the sense that it's complicated. What the Father does, the Son does, and what the Son does, what the Father's shown.
We get a little bit more behind the scenes as well of the disciples trying to nut this through. Like, we don't get the in Matthew we get the Peter declaring that Jesus is the Christ. We don't get that here. But we get a lot more of just sort of the disciples trying to work out what he's trying to puzzle it through.
But we do get Peter saying, but now we believe.
Yes.
Which is John's whole point.
It's similar, but it brings out a different direction because, Matthew is trying to get to a different point, whereas John is trying to kind of, you're almost following these disciples and these people as they are working through this question, who is this man?
One of the interesting contrasts that comes up is this one, the play on the words above and below.
And it kind of extends out to not just these words, but just a way of thinking. When we start the other Gospels, we start, this is where he was born, this is his human genealogy, or, starting in at this is where his ministry is. We're starting from a very, constructing him from the ground up. John, we construct him from the top down. Like, he came from heaven, he's going back to heaven. That's always the way that it progresses.
It's where it begins. In the beginning, in arche. If you go to Septuagint of Genesis 1, in arche, it's the identical phrase.
And he's very specific about doing that. But he's got this concept of almost an above way of thinking and a below way of thinking. And this is what causes a lot of the conflict in John's Gospel, because most of the people he's talking to are trying to approach it from this way. When he's talking to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus isn't getting it. It's Jesus is trying to just sort of draw him into an above way of thinking, and Nicodemus is completely lost because he's so familiar with the below way of thinking. And it's not to necessarily say above is good, but below is bad. But, in terms of John, very much comes from the above perspective and has Jesus trying to draw us through to a higher perspective rather than kind of being stuck in the below ways of thinking. And that's not as explicitly explained in some of the other Gospels, that John is really kind of, and where John's going much deeper into discourse, particularly where it splits people. A lot of the time you've got this sort of interplay between the below thinking and the above thinking.
So you may want to watch for this above and below. And
it's not necessarily just the words. It's kind of more a way of thinking. And particularly if you've got a big moment of conflict, many turned away, that's probably a really good clue that there's one of these going on here.
But there are also the right there in your face ones. I am from above. I came from above. You are from below. To some of them, you are of your father. And there's a whole play on two fathers.
And even jumping ahead a little bit, in John 3, when he's talking to Nicodemus, just before we get to that super famous verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Jesus and Nicodemus have been having a chat. Nicodemus, initially arrives by darkness, so we assume that, but they're having a discourse, and Jesus, you can see him sort of trying to pull him through. And Jesus actually explicitly says, if I've told you earthly things and you don't believe, how will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? You've once you start looking for it, you can kind of see the mindset playing. And John is constantly interplaying between these ideas.
So there's something else to just have in the back of your mind as you're reading through. And you're not going to get all of these on your first go through. At least we didn't.
Probably not even your 10th go through, but that's okay. You'll probably pick up some things that we haven't. So.
Well, I've done at least 15 and I hadn't seen that till you pointed it out earlier today. So this is where also doing it as a group. And maybe you've got some friends that you can gather together with and just tease some of these things out.
Have a Zoom call.
A Zoom call, that works. So there are so many words that we can chase.
And probably will.
And most of these ones I've found are very profitable words.
And a lot of them are layers. Like I am has so many layers because you've got the sort of 7 key I am statements, I am the vine or I am the good shepherd or whatever.
And then you've got the couple of mega ones which simply say, I am.
Which sort of harkens back to your Abrahamic.
And Moses.
Yep. I am that I am. That you've got, multiple layers. Don't just assume that, the almost all of these words, there will be more to dig.
Does that give you something to get started on? You see, this gospel is all about who Jesus is. And we just want to invite you to come on this journey with us. Not to find out what we have found out, but to explore it, to find out for yourself who Jesus is. And our hope is that John's intent, that you may believe and that believing you may find life in his name. Life and life more abundantly will be yours. So come with us on this journey in the Gospel of John on working the word. We look forward to seeing you next week.